morning, and this is Hap May with The Legal Play.
Good morning, Hap, and I am Chelsea El-Azzi. Today's topic is tax opinions, specifically tax opinions done by a tax attorney.
Right, exactly, and that's it's not your opinion that we don't like taxes. That's not the opinion we're talking about.
I mean, I think everybody probably shares that opinion. I don't know anybody who loves to pay taxes.
Yes.
So generally, Hap, what is a tax opinion?
A tax opinion. Of course, people are familiar with the fact that they engage in transactions and they have various tax consequences. Sometimes they're income, sometimes there's a question of whether something's deductible or not, and sometimes it's not really straightforward as to just whether this transaction is something that should be capitalized or expensed, or whether it creates a deduction or whether it creates income. And a lot of times the CPA can figure that out and get comfortable with it. Other times they get a little more complicated, or situation a little more complicated, that you need some sort of tax opinion, an attorney, a qualified tax attorney who has the experience and education necessary to do a deeper dive than just filling out a tax return and make a determination as to what he thinks the particular consequences are, and give some sort of level of comfort to the taxpayer and the tax preparer that this provision is a position that they should take, a deduction they should take, income that they should, or something that's not income, to take a position on a tax return. And there are some benefits to having a qualified tax attorney do that.
I've got a couple questions though before we get into that.
All right.
Can an accountant or a CPA do a tax opinion?
The answer is yes. I mean, they can issue tax opinions whether they meet all the qualifications necessary to and do the research and have the education and experience necessary to be qualified to give an experience that the IRS would rely upon.
Which leads me to the question of why would you then want or need an attorney specifically to give you a tax opinion?
And let's some of the cases where this comes up. It's a CPA that prepares a tax, looks at a situation and says, I am a tax preparer. There's this transaction. I'm not sure exactly how to categorize it. I'd like to do something good for the taxpayer and do it in a way that minimizes his taxes. But I'm not comfortable with whether that's right. And the IRS has these preparer penalties that they will impose upon me if I do something that is just too wrong in the process. So to determine whether or not it's right or not, I want to rely upon somebody who is qualified to look at this and give an opinion. And in most cases, if a qualified tax lawyer issues an opinion that is done properly, and both the taxpayer and the tax preparer rely upon that opinion in filling out the tax return. The tax return is subsequently audited, and the IRS makes an adjustment basically saying that was wrong. Both the taxpayer and the tax preparer can avoid a lot of the really bad penalties for filing frivolous returns or for not having a proper basis for which to take the tax position that they did on the tax return.
And that's if you're using a CPA. I mean, there's some people that file their own taxes, and I think in this case it would be good sometimes to have a tax opinion.
The same would apply there too. I mean the taxpayer who is preparing his own return would have some protection from some of the penalties that would come if, in fact, the IRS and subsequent tax courts or other federal courts disallow whatever was done there.
What I'm hearing is that tax opinions tend to be related to tax return filings. Is that the only time? You send them in with it?
That certainly is not the only time. I mean, a lot of times it's just to determine whether or not a particular transaction should be entered into. Should I enter into this transaction believing that I would only have a gain of X as opposed to a gain of 2X? And if I was worried about that, and somehow that there was some debt involved or some complication to determine how much profit or income would be recognized by engaging in such a transaction, then a tax opinion might help someone make the decision as to whether to do that or not. Mm-hmm. A good example is whether a series of real estate transactions constitutes for what they call a 1031 like-kind exchange, for which gain would be on the relinquished property would be deferred until the sale of the replacement property, and whether or not that qualifies under the particular facts, both in terms of timing-wise and the type of property, whether they would qualify for a 1031 like-kind exchange is the kind of thing you might get a tax opinion on. And somebody that may look at it and says, okay, if this doesn't qualify, then I don't want to do the transaction. And that's another example. Corporate mergers and things of that nature, the tax consequences of that oftentimes have tax opinions that go with them. A lot of times I've had cases where partnerships that you typically buy into real property. Like hotels, apartment complexes, office buildings, but fairly large scale partnerships that they require tax opinions. So the promoters of the deal can show that there is somebody that actually looked at the tax consequences of this is qualified to comment on it, and also to kind of take the onus off them, so that in case that doesn't quite work out tax-wise, they don't have the misrepresentation issues, and they can honestly say, I relied upon somebody else to do that. Mm-hmm. And also, in addition, just meeting that function of saying, well, I can rely on somebody else to get out of penalties or to get out of liability for a deal that didn't go right. It also helps identify what kind of problems there are. A lot of times people have done things that they in order to qualify for something you got to do 10 things. Mm. And after review by a tax attorney, you realize, well, you've only done 9 of them. Mm. And so if you caught that before you entered into the transaction, you can figure out what it's going to take to do that 10th thing and qualify. Where if you didn't have that kind of tax review, that would come from doing a full-blown opinion, you might miss that one thing, and then have the whole transaction disqualified because you missed one element.
Right. I think we've done some tax opinions also for bankruptcy cases.
We do, because that's a lot of what I do. A lot of my background does. It's sort of what I teach out at the University of Houston, bankruptcy taxation. So yeah, that comes into play a lot. Because bankruptcy sometimes have significant tax consequences to them, mm-hmm. And in the particular case that you've had experiences in, we wanted to do it in such a way so that the creditors got more money, and the IRS basically didn't get money that the creditors otherwise would have.
Yeah.
So we had to do some structuring and set up some trusts and enter into some contracts and get a plan approved. But once put all of that together and and give the court the representation and give the court the opinion that this particular transaction will work and more money can go to the judgment creditors in that case,
and that the IRS would accept, all the transactions,
right, and that met the requirements in order to be able to take the deduction that would prevent the IRS from getting money and make the money that the judgment holders or creditors would receive deductible to the paying entity, so we wouldn't have to pay an amount of tax.
So it sounds to me that tax opinions have fairly broad applications.
They do. They do, and there are state and local, tax issues. I remember when the Wayfair case came out, and
the Wayfair case.
somehow that every state that you sent flowers to could collect sales tax. In the process, it kind of threw a wrench into everybody's plans. I mean, that particularly those businesses that are internet based and ship products, perhaps even do some services in more than one state, suddenly had to comply with 50 states. And actually, not actually, there are 46 states that have sales tax, but there's some cities that have state sales tax, and Washington CSA. So how to comply? How does somebody who, some grandma who makes chocolate, treats and ships them out to 50 states going to comply with sales tax in Maine? Suddenly became an issue that we all had to, those who do what I do, tax professionals, suddenly had to figure out and give, some comfort level opinions to.
And speaking of comfort level, you've written a couple of keywords down where, an opinion will let you know its level of sureness about this opinion with certain keywords.
There are two. There are different types of opinions or reasons we might give our opinion. One is just the comfort level, to give the taxpayer the comfort that there's somebody's looked at this and they're doing it right and they're not going to be adverse tax consequences. Sometimes there's a contractual requirement that one party to the contract or both parties to the contract require a tax opinion before the transaction can go forward. There's the third party inducement, kind of what we talked about with regard to investors.
Okay.
Want to make sure that before they invest that somebody has actually looked at this from a tax angle and is expressed, done it thoroughly and expressed an opinion as to whether this is. And sometimes there are disclosure requirements. Do I have to disclose, even though this may or may not be a taxable transaction, do I have to disclose something on my tax return to the IRS? Maybe to my shareholders or something like that relates to a tax matter, and we give opinions as to whether that is necessary or not. Although it's kind of like what I keep telling people is, if you have to ask the question, do I need to disclose this? The answer is probably yes. Sometimes it's not, but that's start with that and then figure out whether or not there's some exception you can get with regard to that. And then the type of opinions that we have, and this is in some of the IRS publications, but there is saying something that this transaction will meet the IRS requirements and will basically not be adjusted by the IRS. Those are very rare that anybody does those. One because why would you need an opinion for something that's obvious?
Yeah.
Probably some of the more common ones is where we issue the opinion that it should, that this particular transaction should be okay, approved by the IRS and not subject to adjustment. And I think there's something like that has to be a 60 or two-thirds chance that it not. I mean, basically is what that should be. Then there is the more likely than not, which basically says there's better than a 50-50 chance this will be upheld. Then we get some cases where we're being a little more aggressive, where the taxpayer and the taxpayer and the tax preparer are being a little more aggressive, where we have, even though the IRS would take the position that this is not acceptable, there is substantial authority that the taxpayer can use to argue that this should be correct.
Mm-hmm. Which might be case law, or
might be case law, might be some
guidance somewhere.
Right. Case law, some red,
or a logic trail. Sometimes that's
sometimes that works. Although
I know, and those are kind of
be careful when you're dealing with the law and trying to apply logic. I mean, you can get into trouble trying to do that. Then if it's not substantial authority, there's a thing called a reasonable basis, and that's probably where you get a little more of your logical arguments with regard to that, where there is a reasonable basis to take this position. Then the one that is kind of the low bottom rung of the totem pole is not frivolous. So I mean, it's a frivolous argument would be that despite the constitutional amendment that authorized it, federal income taxes are still unconstitutional, and you'd be shocked at how many people try to make that argument. That is frivolous. but there are some arguments for which there's not a real good basis for it. But it's
you have a reason.
A reason. There's
might not be a good reason, but it's a reason.
It's not frivolous. It's not something that just on its face is just wrong with regard to that. So those are the kind of different levels, and depending upon where we fit in this opinion or comfort level, the more penalty, the higher you get, the more penalties you can avoid. And the easier it makes the process to go through with regard to the tax return and being able to defend any position that was taken on the tax returns.
Yeah, and I've done a few of these for you.
Yes.
Some more in depth than others, and
yes.
Usually haps because he's been doing this long enough. What usually happens is he's got a good feel for something, and he'll say, "I think it's this, but I need you to go find the authority on that." And then it's my job to dig until I can find.
There's a code section somewhere that says we can.
And there's some opinion, and there's some case law, but go find it, and then it's my job to then go find it and put the authority.
What was the one we had dealt with that you in particular dealt with, the all events test? And 468 trusts.
That one was okay. Honestly, a tricky one was, what authority does a chief restructuring officer have to sign some tax documents?
Right.
And that one was what we were finding was the logic trail, because there was a lot of actual language in statutes and opinion and what do you call it, that the IRS guidance and publications, which said, okay, a trustee can do this.
Right.
But it never said anything specifically about a CRO, a chief restructuring officer.
Right.
And then there would be some bankruptcy law that said, the chief restructuring officer can do X, Y, Z. And so that's why I was kind of like, okay, well, there's this from the IRS and there's this from bankruptcy law, so merge the two together, and we're this is more likely than this should be allowed. It was kind of in that.
That's the kind of thing you need to have. Very good example why you need a tax opinion, because the poor restructuring officer appointed by bankruptcy court says, "Can I sign this or not?"
And we're like, "We're gonna have to get back to you on that." And then he gets a long memo saying, "Well, there's this that says this, and this says this, and this says this, and if you piece them all together." In our opinion, you should be able to
do that. Yes, and that's exactly how the sausage is made. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Well, this is Hap May with the Legal Play, and thank you for tuning in.
Thanks. And if you found this useful, please like and subscribe and share with your friends.
Recording stopped.
All right, that worked.